Do we need a new definition of extremism? Should TikTok be banned? And does anyone need more than £10 million? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative peer James Bethell, Labour peer Ruth Anderson, Tribune editor Taj Ali, and non-affiliated peer and director of the Academy of Ideas Claire Fox. On today's programme.
We cherish free speech in this country, but when it comes to government funding and government engagement, then government, I think, has to be careful about who it provides funds for or who it provides access for.
The Levelling Up Secretary sets out a new definition of extremism.
We now come to questions to the Prime Minister.
Diane Abbott was being talked about at Prime Minister's questions, so why didn't the Speaker allow her to say anything? Their wealth dwarfs that of many countries, so should individuals' wealth be capped at £10 million? And can Keir Starmer do a Tony Blair and make Britannia cool again? Let's just show you the scene in the House of Commons chamber. Angela Rayner, Labour's deputy leader, is responding to Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary, who's been on his feet delivering the government's new definition of extremism. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. But let's start with this headline from BBC News. The US House passes bill that could ban TikTok nationwide. Yes, the US House of Representatives, the lower chamber of Congress, has passed a landmark bill that could see TikTok banned in America. It would give the social media giant's Chinese parent company 6 months to sell its controlling stake, or the app would be blocked in the US. It still needs to be cleared through Senate and be signed by the President to become law. But lawmakers in the United States have long held concerns about China's influence over TikTok. My question, starting with you, James Bethell, is should it be banned here?
Well, the Americans have definitely gone down the national security route, and they have specifically mentioned TikTok. Where I think the British government is rightly concerned is all of the data, the really intimate personal data that we have that is being sent to places like Russia and China. And it might be from your fridge, it might be from your Chinese BYD car, or it might be from TikTok itself. This is completely outside normal legal restraint. And that's why I've moved an amendment in the House of Lords to try and close down this loophole, to make sure that any data that's sent out of this country to places like Russia or China is adequately supervised once it gets there.
And TikTok should be banned?
Well, it would lead to the banning of TikTok in its current form, yeah. But I think, listen, TikTok's a big business. A lot of people make money out of it. I would like it to see legitimised and brought back into the scope of normal law.
Claire, what do you think? Should TikTok be banned here?
Well, obviously, I'm concerned about the free speech implications because we have a situation in which the reason why this might have some resonance, and I mean beyond national security, is that a lot of adults will say to you, oh, my God, it's such a, dangerous, horrible, toxic atmosphere and all the kids are on it. People constantly citing that sort of issue. But I think that that's not TikTok's fault. And to be honest, the fact that so many hundreds of thousands of young people are wandering around saying Osama bin Laden's letter to America is so inspiring might indicate that we've got a problem ourselves, that we're not creating the narrative that might inspire them more. So I think there's a question of adult authority being in crisis and then we try and ban something. That's what we always do, and I get nervous about that.
I think Claire's got a point. There is a surveillance problem, there is an influence problem, and then there's an algorithm problem with our kids, and we shouldn't confuse the three of them. The British government has already identified the surveillance problem, and we've taken TikTok off all government phones. The Americans are worried about the influence problem, and what's happened in the Middle East has amplified that. And I'm personally, as a dad, worried about the algorithm problem.
Right. Ruth, what do you think? I mean, perhaps on the influence issue, do you think TikTok should be banned?
Well, I don't agree with banning either. I mean, free speech is an incredibly important thing as a concept, but there is an issue about TikTok and national security. So TikTok, we can talk about social media in the broadest terms, and then we can talk about TikTok. There is clearly a national security issue which American politicians may be privy to, which our government will be privy to. And so we're going to have to be very careful. But then there's also personal data issues. In terms of influence, I think Claire's right about being able to put forward alternative narratives and alternative arguments and having influencers which can engage. I mean, we're going to talk about celebrity endorsements, but we shouldn't dismiss when people use their voices to challenge a narrative.
What about you, Taj?
I mean, I looked at that debate and I heard the comments from Republican senators and they were referring to young people, particularly talking about Palestine, for instance, on TikTok. And there's this narrative that, you know, there's Chinese propaganda and it's turning young people into a certain way. And actually, on Palestine, you know, we know that young people are more sympathetic to the Palestinian people. You don't need much convincing to think the killing of kids is wrong. I think there's a broader problem in social media around misinformation, around abuse, and that's not restricted to TikTok. We see it on Twitter, we see it on Facebook, we see it on Instagram, on the issue of data privacy and the mining of personal data. That is also an issue on Instagram and Twitter and all these other platforms. So let's have a consistent line on this.
Right, are you on TikTok?
I don't really use TikTok.
Claire?
No.
I've looked at it. No. And one of the things that's really annoying is when people say, I must go on TikTok because that'll prove as an old person I can have an influence. You know what I mean?
Is that what
the worst? There has been. Yeah.
But you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, what I was going to say was I think that James has tried to untangle the different elements. But as I think Taj has rightly pointed out, despite that, everybody talked about influence on young people in the debate in America. So the truth is, it does start to merge. I thought it was interesting that yesterday, you know, actually in the Lords, there was an amendment passed and the government has now come out in support of foreign state ownership of the media in relation to the Telegraph and the Spectator. That seems to me to be sensible, but it's also the case that there is a danger where that starts to bleed into any foreign influence. And I don't think that's helpful, as it happens, because I think you can
Or consistent, in fact.
I mean, it's all I'm saying is that this is not a Chinese state-owned enterprise, even if we think they have an influence on us.
It isn't technically state-owned, but we know that the Communist Party has people on the board and huge amounts of influence. And if we could tidy up that ambiguity, maybe by taking it into proper Western control, then I think the business could flourish and protect the freedom of speech issues, which is right. It is this Communist Party control problem that I think is on a lot of people's minds.
As I mentioned, the Levelling Up Secretary, Michael Gove, has been delivering a statement in the House of Commons. But let's just show you this. Do you remember, from Rishi Sunak?
The time has now come for us all to stand together to combat the forces of division and beat this poison. We must face down the extremists who would tear us apart. There must be leadership, not pandering or appeasement.
So that was the Prime Minister giving a speech outside Downing Street a few weeks ago, warning about a rise in extremist activity since the attacks by Hamas on October the 7th in Israel. Hamas designated a terrorist organisation by the UK government. That call for action by Rishi Sunak has been answered by Michael Gove, who has unveiled, as I said, this new extremism definition under which certain groups will be blocked from government funding and meeting officials. Now, we don't know yet which groups the government proposes to label as extremist, but we can see here in the Daily Telegraph that Michael Gove is to identify Muslim groups as extremists, according to them. Well, let's hear what the Community Secretary had to say.
Extremism is the promotion or advancement of an ideology based on violence, hatred or intolerance that aims to negate or destroy the fundamental rights and freedoms of others, or undermine, overturn or replace the UK system of liberal parliamentary democracy and democratic rights, or intentionally create a permissive environment for others to achieve these results. It is important to stress that we are in no way intending to restrict freedom of expression, religion or belief. But the government cannot be in a position where, unwittingly or not, we sponsor, subsidise or support in any way organisations and individuals opposed to the freedoms we hold dear.
Now, I said that he hadn't named groups yet designated as falling foul of the new of the new definition, but he has named a number of groups that could be deemed extremists, and I'll read them out to you. They are the British National Socialist Movement, the Patriotic Alternative, the Muslim Association of Britain, the British affiliate of the Muslim Brotherhood, CAGE, MEND, 5 Pillars and the Friends of Al-Aqsa. Now, as I say, they haven't yet been designated as extremists, but he has named them in the House of Commons. Of course, you have, to a certain extent, parliamentary privilege when naming groups or individuals. But just to go back on principle to the question of whether we need a new definition of extremism, what is the problem precisely that the government is trying to solve?
Well, I think it is one thing to know that a group is actively involved in terrorism and is therefore in breach of the law. And then there is this shadow category of people who support extremism. It's the Sinn Féin problem. But you are enhancing them when you meet them as a minister. And this has been going on, this problem has been going on for a long time, and trying to clarify that ambiguity, I think, is a helpful step by the government.
Right, so you do support this idea of a new definition of extremism?
With regret. Listen, I can see the dangers. I can see a group that I personally think perfectly legitimate gets put on that list. I would feel very hard done by. But the lack of clarity and the cynicism with which some groups are using government engagement in order to ultimately promote terrorism means that this is necessary.
Ruth, do you agree with that? I mean, I'll just show our viewers, this is on the gov.uk website. Extremism is the promotion or advancement of an ideology based on violence, hatred or intolerance that aims to negate or destroy the fundamental rights and freedom of others. You can see the rest there: undermine, overturn or replace the UK system of liberal parliamentary democracy and intentionally create a permissive environment for others to achieve the results just outlined in 1 or 2. Do we need this new definition?
I think we need more than a definition. We need action. You know, this is about we haven't had an update to the counter-extremism policy strategy for 9 years. We've seen huge amounts of anti-Semitic hate and anti-Muslim hate on our streets and in our communities and online. So this needs to be looked at in the round, and new words aren't going to get us anywhere, actually. So what we need is to know what is going to happen in terms of the wider strategy behind it, what we're talking about in terms of resource. And this needs to be done in a way that brings people together and doesn't add to more toxic nature of the debate. Should be done on a cross-party basis, should be based on evidence, should all be about community cohesion and not about yet more division, especially in a very toxic political environment in a general election year.
Do you think a new definition will bring communities together?
Absolutely not. I think this is creating problems. I mean, if we take this definition around the promotion of violence and hatred and intolerance, surely that Tory donor who said that Diane Abbott, the first black female MP, should be shot, is an extremist, and therefore the Conservative Party is funded by extremists. And so my point is this: it's a subjective definition. It's not clear-cut. And the other thing I want to say is, you know, we're talking about undermining democracy and undermining our rights, and we're linking this to what's happening in Palestine. I've been on many of these very peaceful demonstrations which reflect public opinion. 71% of the British public support an immediate ceasefire in Gaza.
Do you think there have been any elements within those demonstrations that promoting ideas that might fall foul of this?
Well, the Met Police themselves have described these demonstrations as overwhelmingly peaceful. There's been very few arrests, and so we can't make generalisations and we can't group people together. I think it's really, really important when we're talking about undermining democracy that we talk about the threat to our right to strike, our right to protest, and that's the real threat to democracy at the moment. When you group peaceful protesters with violent extremists, you play into the hands of the extremists because you create a them and us mentality.
Do you think there's been a rise in extremist activity in the way the Prime Minister and the government say?
I think they're generalising here. I think perhaps there have been individuals who express things in extreme ways, and we've seen that from the far right and we've seen that from Islamists. But they are grouping together very peaceful populations who reflect the opinion of the UN Secretary General, the World Health Organization. This isn't extremism, this is mainstream public opinion.
Claire?
I think that this is a cowardly act that will not state what has really been of great concern to many people in recent months, which is, and actually years, which is that we've got a problem of radical Islamist views that people won't confront. And there's a fear that if you say that, you will be accused of being anti-Muslim or Islamophobia, which is then used as a sort of catch-all as anti-Muslim. So I think that, and that's what's prompted it. And then there's this attempt at saying, you know, these vile organisations like Patriotic Alliance, for example, but, you know, God, who are they, you know, in terms of a very non-influential versus a more influential idea. But I think one of the things which is really interesting is the government say that, you know, anyone, you know, an extremist is somebody who who expresses hatred or intolerance. Let me just state now, I'm intolerant of anti-Semitism and I hate bigotry. So there we go. That's that. Well, what does that mean? The second thing is that he's emphasised, well, there's this problem, which is that government keep meeting these organisations. I don't know how that's happened. Well, it's like, well, that's government's fault, right? And one of the problems is that in an era of identity politics, often government will outsource their authority by saying, oh, well, we've met the leadership of this particular community and they've told us to do this. We then find out government has been giving them a load of money, right? It's hiding behind these organisations. They've created monsters of their own because they haven't got the courage and the confidence to confront what's really the issue in society.
Do you agree with Claire on failing to confront the real issue, which is Islamism?
I think too often the distinction is not made between Islamism and Muslims who engage in peaceful political activity. And with the rise in Islamophobia, we've seen a 335% increase in Islamophobic hate crime. It does create an atmosphere where British Muslims feel like they are being surveilled.
You can't make the distinction. I mean, that's the reason why we should be able to talk about it. The reason why we should be able to talk about it openly without fear that somebody's going to shout Islamophobic or bigot at you is that actually Islamism is not about all Muslims, but you can't have the conversation about Islamism. So as a consequence, you can't make that distinction. So when you say Muslims are fearful, what I would suggest is that we have an open public discussion about the fact that, 94 people have been killed by radical Islamists since 7/7. That's a lot of people, right? That's pretty extreme. And that also people are espousing views which has given a green light, and I do not think this is the equivalent, by the way, to Islamophobia, that's given the light to a visceral, real, genuine expression of anti-Jewish hatred on the streets of the UK, which people are unabashed about. I mean, they're not even embarrassed, and they think this is a perfectly acceptable thing to do because you don't like Israel. Well, it is not acceptable, but I still don't think it should be banned. I think it should be argued about openly, and we should name the problem instead of hiding behind these generalised
Absolutely,
definitions.
and we will not talk about Islamophobia. We don't want to name Islamophobia because we want to have a nonsense debate about terminology. Well, we've seen a 335% increase in Islamophobic hate crime. We have to deal with the here and now, and right now, Muslim communities are under threat. We've seen an increase in hate crime, and that should be our priority. And on the point on anti-Semitism, for me, it's the same struggle. It's always been the same struggle, whether it's a Muslim woman who wears a headscarf facing abuse on public transport or a Jewish man wearing a kippah. And we have always made the distinction between, criticism of the State of Israel and anti-Semitism, and those things are not mutually exclusive.
No, I mean, the lines have been blurred, I suppose, is what Claire has been saying. And Ruth, in terms of the sort of government response, there has been criticism that the Conservatives are politicising this. I mean, we've had 3 former Home Secretaries say that it's been politicised. We've had the Archbishop's worrying, dangerous precedent being set. And I'll come to Libertarians on the right of the Conservative Party who are worried for different reasons. Is there a problem there?
There absolutely is a problem. I think we need to be really clear. There's no hierarchy of racism. There is none. Racism is racism. One of the problems that we've got is from a government that seems to be completely struggling to be able to say the words Islamophobia. They can't come up with a definition of what Islamophobia is, which we need. We've got a new definition of extremism. We haven't got a definition of what anti-Muslim hate actually is. That is state accepted. And the idea that we are, the anti-Muslim working group hasn't met for over 5 years at a time when we have seen huge amounts of racism on our streets. And, I, as a Jewish woman, have experienced appalling racism over the last 8 years. But I live in a community where my Muslim community is scared. And, at various points since October 7th, I have been so grateful for the support I've received from the Muslim community, but we have held each other. My senior, some of my Muslim counsellors, we have held each other in fear of what is happening in our community and how it is not safe on certain days for either of us to venture out, and how we need to be careful. And
is that because it's being captured, though, by extremists?
But there's also the political, it's being captured, but also the political debate is doing nothing to bring people together. This can't be a party political football. This is not about a cultural war. This has to be about how we fix the country.
I think you need to give the government a little bit more credit than that. Okay. I actually think that they've been extremely moderate. They have tiptoed around a lot of these subjects in order to try to avoid politicising lots of the tensions that are in our community. And I think what Michael Gove has done today is proportionate and extremely reasonable.
Right. I mean, we will, of course, know the details and groups that may or may not be included. It's important to state that this is about government contracts. These are about the people, as you say, that government are actually associating themselves with. But, Ruth, do you think there is a difference between that and you were talking about the counter-terrorism strategy? That is something quite different.
And the counter-extremism strategy.
Oh, the counter-extremism.
It's 9 years since the counter-extremism strategy was updated at a time when the world just changed beyond recognition, whether that relates to Ukraine, to Russia, to China, to events in our own community. We're talking about extremism. We've had an extended debate about the Online Safety Act without updating what counter-extremism should look like in the UK.
Does that... Oh, yeah, go on.
No, sorry, the reason why I'm frustrated is because if you actually look at the William Shawcross report on Prevent, but this is how these things become. If you're overgeneral, right, so again, Prevent was set up after 7/7 because of the worry about the fact that, for goodness sake, UK Asian youth were so radicalised that they went and bombed their fellow citizens. I mean, that's like a blow, right? And some of them went off and to fight for ISIS. And so they were trying to tackle it. Then they make it so general that we got into a situation where Prevent was widely used. I mean, I remember talking to a head teacher who said they brought in Prevent because the sixth form had a vote and they'd voted to leave the EU in the North East, and he thought this was an example of extremism.
Well, because public bodies were being asked to intervene.
Yeah, and Taj is absolutely right to say the problem we've got here is that extremism ends up, and in fact in the papers today it's something like anything that goes beyond the acceptable mainstream. It's like, well, we're all out. I mean, what does that mean? I want us to have a radical, lively political discourse without fear of what we say. However, if somebody says something that I consider to be an atrocious part of bigotry, or that they, you know, I had a row.
But are you going to report them?
No, I'm not going to report them. I'm going to argue with them. The point is, I'm going to argue with them in front of an audience.
That's different from an individual to what a government would do and what the obligation would be.
The government needs to argue too. Okay. The government needs to create a space where you can have that argument without everyone pointing the finger at each other and saying, I'm going to report you. I'm going to report you now. I'm going to cancel you. We've got enough cancel culture without increasing.
Just on that point, around the Prevent agenda, a former pupil at my high school was reported to the Prevent agenda for wearing a Palestine badge. He had police officers come to his house. Then they found out he comes from a Shia background and left him alone. So there's a lot of ignorance around religion and around extremism. We've heard from Amnesty International just yesterday that a trade union representative was reported to this de-radicalisation programme for posting about anti-racism and socialism on the internet. So clearly we need some better guidance in general around extremism. I think it is a problem, but I think too often we're using these broad stroke definitions, which isn't just an attack on Muslims, it's going to be used against other people as well.
All right, before we move on, I need to make a correction because the list of groups that I read out, 2 of them weren't actually mentioned by Michael Gove. 5 Pillars and the Friends of Al-Aqsa, just to clarify, in terms of the groups that are perhaps being looked at by Michael Gove.
Because I immediately thought 5 Pillars, fair enough. So that'll just show you.
Oh, well, there we go. You can have your own... Yes, I know, it underlines your point.
That you think, oh, what have they done right?
Let me just pick up on Taj's remarks earlier, and that was talking about the Conservative donor Frank Hester. We've talked a lot about him or his comments that he is alleged to have made. Michael Gove was on BBC Breakfast this morning and he was asked whether the comments by the Conservative donor would fall under this new definition of extremism. Let's have a look.
When Frank Hester allegedly said that, and I want to get this quote right, I don't hate all black women at all, but I think she should be shot. Is that an extremist view?
Well, speaking as someone who was pursued by an individual who was trying to kill me and who subsequently succeeded in killing one of my friends in Parliament, I take that sort of language very seriously and I think it's unacceptable.
I'm sorry, that's not quite what I asked. Is that an extremist view and would it fall under these new rules, these new definitions of extremism? I can repeat the quote for you if you wish again.
Well, I take these things exceptionally seriously, and because I take them seriously, it would be the case that any assessment about whether or not an individual or an organisation is extremist would have to follow a rigorous process. It wouldn't be me making a decision on the basis of a quote, however horrific. It would be a due diligence process that would be conducted very carefully.
James Bethell, do you think those remarks alleged to have been made by Frank Hester would fall under this new definition of extremism?
You know, Joe, I'm not a lawyer. I can't answer that question. What I do know is that advocating violence like that is totally distasteful. Shouldn't happen. It makes me sick to hear those words, and certainly I condemn them.
Right. I mean, should the Conservative Party give Frank Hester the money back? £10 million donation.
You know, this money back thing is always tricky because they've probably already spent it. It's like giving the Sacklers back their money for all the donations they've given, and all the political parties have got some shockers in the donation front, and it's very, very difficult to give the money back. I definitely think they should review the relationship with him if he was found to have actually said these words.
What do you think, Ruth, in terms of an individual's comments that are reported to have been racist and sexist and stupid, according to a whole variety of people, certainly within the Conservative Party?
I think we need to step back and remember who they're talking about. They're talking about Diane Abbott, and who was a trailblazer, who was elected in 1987 as the first ever black woman in our parliament, and she deserves respect and to be treated with dignity, and that is not happening here. And repeatedly, it is women in public life who are attacked if they are from minorities. And you look at the way that she's had more collective abuse than any other politician. And then you look at how Margaret Hodge, Nuz Ghani, people like me have been treated online every time we open our mouths. I don't doubt that because I'm on here today, there will be more abuse for me. So there is an issue here about how we speak about each other.
Right.
But this is illegal. What he said was illegal.
Sure,
it was
but
incitement.
on Diane Abbott, you say she should be treated with respect. Has she been treated with respect by the Labour Party?
In what way?
Well, she's been investigated for 11 months. She's been suspended by the Labour Party for comments that she made last year. I mean, in her letter, it was in an opinion piece in The Guardian, she wrote that Irish, Jewish and traveller people undoubtedly experience prejudice, which she said is similar to racism. She continued, it's true that many types of white people with points of difference, such as redheads, can experience this prejudice, but they are not all their lives subject to racism. She was suspended, she's been investigated, and she's still waiting for the outcome.
I spent 5 years as a Labour Member of Parliament begging my party to take the politics out of our disciplinary process. That has now happened in my party. I've sat in rooms with Keir Starmer, figuring out who is a committed anti-racist, finding ways to make sure that politicians were no longer involved in the disciplinary process as my party, which is exactly what's happened here.
Right, because, I mean, it's basically 4 sentences in a letter. It was 11 months ago. I'm not saying which way they should find, but it should have been resolved, shouldn't it?
Rightfully, this is nothing at all to do with the politicians in the Labour Party. This is about our internal processes. So I can't update, I can't tell you.
I mean, this is a headline in The Independent. Yes, Diane Abbott has penned this piece. The Tories are outrageously racist and sexist, but Labour is guilty too. And she is referring to WhatsApp messages that were uncovered during the Martin Ford report. He was looking into claims of anti-Semitism in Jeremy Corbyn's time. But she said that unveiled there were disparaging, derogatory messages from Labour officials about her. So again, I mean, what do you say in response to saying Labour is guilty too of these things?
Labour commissioned Martin Ford to do a report. We have adopted the overwhelming number of his recommendations, and we're moving forward. We're trying to rebuild our party from it being completely broken. And there is no hierarchy of racism. What we've done is institute a new process that works for everybody, but that where politics and politicians have been removed, and that is the right thing to have done.
Just can I say on the toxic atmosphere that the headline of that article,
the one in The Independent,
is that the Tories are outrageously racist, and so the Labour Party too. Can I just point out that I don't think that's true? Right. I think that that's what doesn't help, right? What happens is we now end up saying that whole party is racist.
Yeah.
Worse than that, because it basically turns racism into a political weapon. So I'm afraid I disagree with that. I, on the other hand, think that Diane Abbott should have been taken yesterday by the Speaker. It was absolutely ludicrous.
Well, can I interrupt you then? Just show our viewers, because obviously we were covering Prime Minister's questions, but our viewers will not have been able to see. I think we can show you the footage because there's been some criticism. You can see Diane Abbott in the top right-hand corner in a red shirt, and she's bobbing, is what we call it, up and down to try and catch the eye of the Speaker, bearing in mind all the politicians were talking about Diane Abbott being the target of these alleged comments. You don't think that was...
She bobbed 46 times.
She did.
I mean, I have to do a bit of bobbing in the House.
That was a lot of exercise.
46 times when they're talking about you is an outrage. I thought that was a complete terrible treatment, but got nothing to do necessarily with racism, but it was terrible treatment. But I also want to state that I thought that Diane Abbott's original article, what she said, was anti-Semitic. And because what she did was, she did what is now actually very fashionable, which is to say that, oh, Jewish people, they're sort of white. Actually, they're white and privileged, right? They kind of, we can't have anti-Semitism count because they're not the lowest. And that's the competitive racism that I think has been so toxic and so destructive. So I don't care what the Labour Party do. I don't want to now turn Diane Abbott into a saint, even though I agree she was a trailblazer and she should have been taken yesterday in the House of Commons.
Should she be readmitted to the Labour Party?
Absolutely. She apologised straight away. The treatment of white male Labour MPs has been very different. She's clearly being treated differently.
Well,
but also, let's remember what the Ford report actually said. It identified a hierarchy of racism within the Labour Party. We have to remember that the vast majority of black people in this country, Muslim people in this country, engage in party politics through the Labour Party. The Muslim Network report from a few years ago found 1 in 3 British Muslims had experienced Islamophobia within the Labour Party. Black female Labour MPs, Dawn Butler and many others, have repeatedly said that the Labour Party does not take anti-black racism seriously. And so she's apologised. I think she was wrong to say what she said, but she has apologised. She's very sincere about that, and she should absolutely be readmitted. And I think the Labour Party is not doing anywhere near enough to tackle this disgusting racism and this disrespect that Diane Abbott was subjected to. Let's remember what the report said. It said that Diane Abbott was found crying in the loo, and you had senior Labour officials taking the mickey out of her. I mean, that's completely unacceptable. She's going back to work the next day and she's working with these people. It's a joke.
Ruth?
The Ford report has been implemented. The recommendations of the Ford report have been implemented. I am not going to comment on the current, nor should I comment on the current investigation.
No, but what
Diane
about
Abbott.
just generally the treatment? Diane Abbott says she hasn't received an apology for some of the things that Taj has said. Are there issues that need answering, even if you might agree with Claire that that headline is over the top?
I think that there has been a huge change in what the Labour Party was from then to now. We're talking about a different leadership, different staff, different everything since since that point. Keir Starmer wasn't leader of the Labour Party, and as you know, my own experiences of the Labour Party at that time weren't exactly brilliant.
No, well, that's obviously, as you say, that was under Jeremy Corbyn's...
This was under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. I mean, I think that's the thing that everyone needs to remember. What came out and those text messages was under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. So I don't think that we can say that...
And also, and Diane Abbott was a great supporter. So, you know, but what I want is, I want to be able to say, I agree with Diane Abbott on this, I don't agree with her on this. What I don't want is, and I even want to say to you, about Islamophobia. You know, you keep saying that word. I mean, anti-Muslim hatred is very different to Islamophobia, which I want the freedom to criticise Islam, to make fun of it.
Have I, on this programme, said you're not allowed to criticise my religion? I'm talking about violence and abuse directed to British Muslims.
But
this isn't about terminology. You can criticise religion as much as you like.
I know, good. However, the definitions of Islamophobia would not allow that. And there is a concern that you will bring in blasphemy by the back door. There is my concern. I know, but I should be able to say that. I also think that there is a danger that every time you're talking about one thing, you end up having another racism to contend with. And I do think that does create a competitiveness. And as I've suggested, Diane Abbott was reflecting at that time it was fashionable to say, and the Jews don't really count in that competitive racism question.
All right.
And that's become fashionable again today, and it's a problem.
Just briefly, in response to what Ruth said, is it better under Keir Starmer's leadership?
Absolutely not. I mean, I myself have experienced Islamophobia within the Labour Party, and British Muslims have repeatedly told me about their own experiences. And so, no, I don't think it's better under Keir Starmer. I think he takes British Muslims for granted.
All right.
I think he does not take seriously racism against black people.
That headline, Claire said, is not true in her words. Do you agree? The Tories are outrageously racist and sexist. You may not believe they're all racist and sexist, but is there a real problem?
I've been in the Tory party for 50 years. I remember when it was an anti-Semitic, misogynistic, racist place. I remember in my local Tory association there used to be a sign saying "No blacks served here." I mean, it was an organisation that was out of date. It has come a very, very long way, and you only have to look at the cabinet to see who's running the show and what it looks like today. Are there people like Hester in there? Yes, of course there are. But I think that as an organisation,
but you shouldn't give the money back, even if you've.
But I don't know if that. I mean, I'm just making the practical point.
As a
giving money
principle,
back is always really difficult because you've probably spent.
Yeah, but if the party's changed, wouldn't that send a big signal?
It would be a signal. You're right, but it's a strange principle. I think you have to talk to the Treasury about whether they can do that or not.
I don't understand. I mean, the thing about the funding is, I know there's been controversy about the likes of Dale Vince giving money to the Labour Party, and we've just been discussing extremism, and he's a great fan of Just Stop Oil, and then actually some of the things he said about the 7/7, anti-Jewish pogrom and Hamas and so on are dodgy to say the least. Now, I think it just misses the point of what we should be talking about. If you're going around going, give the money back, you're this kind of bigot, you're that kind.
All right.
Yes, say it when they're bigoted.
Yeah.
And say it's and the fact that the Tories sat
let's
around
not talk about
racism,
Dale Vince because he's not here. Right. Let's move on because we're going to talk about something called limitarianism. Ingrid Robbins, a Dutch philosopher and economist who believes we should put a cap on the super rich to tackle extreme wealth concentration and reduce inequality. And that is what she calls limitarianism. Let's talk to her. She set the limit at £10 million. Why?
Yes, well, the limit, as I put it on 10 million, is because there the harms that wealth concentration does to society will be balanced off with the need to still create room for entrepreneurs. But what the most important point about limitarianism is that just like we have a poverty line where we want nobody to fall below, there should be something like an upper limit where we think nobody should be situated above, because the money doesn't add to the quality of life, and because it harms society, it undermines democracy, it's incompatible with ecological sustainability, and there's also a deeper fundamental philosophical argument that actually nobody deserves so much money.
OK. James, Bethel, you were shaking your head.
I'm a full-blooded capitalist. I've seen what capitalism has done to lift people out of poverty in China, in Africa, around the world. It is the most amazing engine for enterprise, for innovation, and for wealth creation. I mean, I am a capitalist. I think that monopolies are bad. I sometimes look around some of the rich people that there are in the world and I think to myself, they're benefiting from really illegal arrangements where they own just too much of a marketplace. For sure, there is excess. But the idea that people are going to stop working, are going to work hard when they've got 10 million in the bank out of some altruistic compulsion is just unrealistic and will be very, very damaging for the poorest in society.
Ingrid?
No, I really don't think this is true. Well, I encourage you to read my book because I really respond to those objections. I'm not against capitalism. I just think the form of capitalism that we currently have and the public policies that we've had since the late 70s have actually been pro-rich rather than pro-poor. And it's true that the number of people living in absolute poverty, and that's a very low threshold, has gone down. But there were alternative scenarios possible where we would have lifted many more people, but it would meant that a little bit less had gone to the shareholders. So I think we need to talk about a different form of capitalism.
All right.
Yeah.
I think if you settled on your last point of society being a bit more progressive, and had we focused on looking after those who live in deprivation, for sure, 100% I'm on your side. But capping people, I mean, it's a nice headline and it captures attention, but it's totally unrealistic. And by the way, unprincipled and really against common law. So on every level, I'm a big objector to the big headline you've got.
The law should follow a morality. So I'm a moral philosopher.
Not everyone's agreed that we're not even around this table do we all have the same morality.
No, but look, once upon a time, slavery was legal. So the question is, what are the fundamental,
isn't like owning a slave.
What are the fundamental arguments for wanting to say that there should be a limit to how much wealth an individual can aspire to? And here we go to the question about what can you say you deserve as a human being? And I think the kind of dominant culture we've created, not just under capitalism in general, but this form of capitalism, is that we think we can take credit for whatever falls in this system into our hands. But we tend to underplay the huge importance of luck. Because if we were to have really equal opportunities, genuine equal opportunities, we would cancel out the effects of unequal class effects of education and so forth. But we don't start from a level playing field.
Those 2 points are interesting about law or governments following morality and luck.
I live in Stoke-on-Trent. I live in one, and I represented people who are genuinely struggling right now. I am much more interested in making sure that my former constituents and my friends and neighbours have enough money to pay their bills and to look after their families. And the reality is they're £1,200 a month, £1,200 a year worth off, and their mortgages have gone through the roof. So they aren't where they need to be at all. Yeah. But paying taxes and the right level of taxes is a patriotic duty, and that is incredibly important. And the Labour Party desperately wants to see our economy grow, and you don't do that by stopping entrepreneurial growth. You just don't. So from our perspective, I need more money to spend on the NHS, to spend on our public services, to spend on our national defence. We can only do that if the economy is growing. And yes. I'm really sorry, but I don't think this helps us ensure that our economy grows.
But yes, so I think the disagreement is really about what economists call the incentive effects. If you were to reform the economy in such a way that there would be less inequality, would people still work if there would be a limit to how much they can earn in personal wealth? I'm not talking about company wealth. And there are two questions. Why would anybody only be motivated if they were to have more money than 10 million personal wealth? And you can put the cap also at another level. It's really about a principle discussion. Yeah. And the second question is, it's also, I see libertarianism as it's a philosophical exercise, so I think through the reasons. It's what I call a regulative ideal, so something that is, I actually don't think it's going to be realized anytime soon, perhaps never. But the question is about the arguments. All right, what do we make of the arguments?
Well, let's take the arguments to our other guests. Is this an idea you could support, limiting an individual's wealth at £10 million?
Well, I'd need to read the book and think about it, but I think it's really good that we're having this debate, because too often we tend to focus on the poorest in society. We talk about benefit caps for people who don't have very much, and we know there's been deaths linked to cuts to welfare. We've never heard about a significant number of deaths linked to people having their wealth capped or paying a higher rate of taxation. And so I think when we think about where we are as a society today, you've got these oligarchs buying up property in central London and using it as speculative bubble. And at the same time, you've got people on the streets homeless. I mean, clearly there is a moral argument around redistribution of wealth, and I think we're not doing enough redistribution. We pretend we've got no money. We don't talk about taxing the wealthiest in society, and that is something that's supported by the vast majority of the British public. Poll after poll has demonstrated that the British public do support. I think there was a poll by YouGov which found that if you have assets over 10 million, which is a similar figure to what we're discussing here, I think it was over 70% would support a higher rate of tax.
I mean, I think a lot of people support higher rates of tax on people who aren't them, and are surprised sometimes to find that it is them who would be caught up, rightly or wrongly. But in terms of inequality, reducing inequality, would this work? Could this work?
I think so. I think, it depends where that money goes. But as I said, I worked in a factory. I used to do 12-hour night shifts. I worked in a takeaway. I worked in a call centre. I wasn't paying a higher rate of tax. Now I'm doing a bit better for myself and I'm paying a bit more. And it doesn't affect me. It doesn't massively impact me. And that's what we need to look at. Right. The disparity between the poorest in society, it affects them because they're picking between heating and eating. We've got record numbers using food banks. We've got people really struggling with their health and the inequalities associated, the health inequalities associated with the wealth divide.
Claire.
OK, no, there should not be a cap on how much money people have because we live in a free society. Do I find it distasteful that some oligarchs spend all their money on yachts or whatever? Yes, right, that's fair enough. But I also am reminded that some of them are great philanthropists, some of them actually reinvest, so we have to be careful about generalising. The other thing is that it reminds me of that argument when we are told to think, well, why would anyone need more than 10 million? I mean, God, I can barely, I can't imagine myself. But on the other hand, it reminds me of that argument where people say, why do those working class people need more than one car? Or why do they need to, smoke? Or why do they need... It's a kind of moralistic disdain for other people's choices. I think what we need, however, is economic growth, massive increase in productivity, and everyone should join a trade union. Because one of the things I'm always worried about in terms of redistribution is that it becomes like the rich people have got to give to the poor people, as though poor people are kind of to be done to. What I think is that people need to organise to have a more fair society, but it's not individual rich people that's our problem.
Ingrid, you've got 10 seconds for a final thought.
Yes, so I think where we should start is to reduce inequality, and I think I can go a long way also with those who want more progressive taxation. And the important thing is not taxation on income, but taxation on capital gains, which is really where the top 1% gets its income, and that's not affecting the large part of the population.
All right, Ingrid Robbins, thank you very much for joining us for that final discussion on Politics Live today. Politics UK will be here tomorrow, and I'll be back on Monday. Bye.